It didn't take Savannah long in life to realize how pretty of a girl she was. Even by the age of 10, it seemed like she could get her way and influence people just by giving them a smile and batting her beautiful eyes. As she grew older, she only became prettier and used this more and more to her advantage. Savannah by no means had it easy in life while growing up. In fact, her good looks were just about the only thing she really had going for her. Both of her parents were pretty heavy into drugs. They both used drugs, and her father supported both their habits and the household by also selling them. And unfortunately, this would eventually cause him to lose his life. When Savannah was only 4 years old, her father was murdered in a drug deal gone wrong. No one was ever caught or charged for his murder, but from what the police could gather, it looks like one or more individuals had set him up. They believe her father had met up with someone to sell them drugs, but instead fell victim to being robbed. Upon putting up a fight, he was then shot to death, and his murderers made off with everything he had on him. This, of course, was nothing short of devastating for young Savannah. Despite the horrors drugs had caused for the family, Savannah's mom continued on with her ever-growing drug habit. It took her mom less than a year to remarry to another man. This man would eventually turn out to be no better for the family than her dad was, and when Savannah was 7 years old, she would once again fall victim to tragedy within her family. After one long, drug-fueled night, her mother and stepfather ended up getting into a very heated fight. This fight escalated throughout the night and didn't stop escalating until her mother was strangled to death by her husband. After realizing what he had done, he fled the house, leaving none other than Savannah to discover her mom's lifeless body the following morning. Not knowing what to do, Savannah fled to her neighbor's house in a fit of panic. After her neighbor came to evaluate the scene themselves, they immediately called the police. Savannah was able to tell the police that only her mom and her stepdad were in the house the night before, and after she told them the name of her stepdad, they already knew exactly who he was, due to having such a long rap sheet of all sorts of offenses, many on the violent side. It took the police 2 days to track this man down. Whether he really thought he could win a gun battle against a small battalion of police officers, or had opted to choose suicide by cop is unknown. But regardless, he was gunned down shortly after the officers made contact with him, and was pronounced dead on the scene. It was at this point that Savannah became an orphan. This unfortunate situation was due to the fact that she simply had no other family to live with. Just like any 7-year-old would be, she was heartbroken over the loss of her mother, and terrified of having to go live with strangers. The next 2 days consisted of this traumatized young girl being passed around from place to place and from person to person as she was forced through the system. Eventually, social workers found a spot for her at what they deemed to be an appropriate foster home. Savannah and her few possessions were moved into the large, weird house, her new home. She was one of 8 children that would be living at this particular home, with ages ranging from 4 to 14. Upon meeting her new foster mother, and the other children she would be living with, comfort was the furthest thing that she felt. The day-to-day life of Savannah and those living around her seemed to just flash by, as she was just going through the motions. These first couple years after her mother's death, she struggled greatly dealing with life. She was depressed and kept to herself. She refused to make any friends, and limited her overall interaction with others to the bare minimum, including those she lived with. Her foster mom, Meredith, seemed to be a loving, decent woman with good intentions, but Meredith consistently had her hands full with the day-to-day chaos of trying to care for so many children. This provided Savannah with the opportunity to go unnoticed and live in the shadows most of the time. At this point in time, Savannah wanted nothing else but to be left to herself. But what this young, broken girl wanted, and what she actually needed, was far different. It wasn't until these couple years had passed that things began to change for her. At the age of 10, Savannah began to come out of her shell. She finally appeared to be adjusting to the circumstances surrounding her life. But it wasn't that she just had some type of epiphany or breakthrough all on her own. Several months after her 10th birthday, yet again, a bedroom had opened up at the foster home. During her first couple years at the house, Savannah had seen many other children come and go. Some are placed in the home temporarily, while others are placed indefinitely. Due to the fact that Savannah had no other family available to adopt her, she was one of the children remaining in the house indefinitely. This meant she would stay in the house until she was either an adult or was moved to another house for a certain reason. Having no reason to be moved elsewhere and still being so young, she continued to remain at the home. She had met plenty of other children while living at the home, but never developed any real type of friendship with them. That all changed when Bailey moved into the home. Bailey was a 13-year-old boy that had been bounced around through the children's services system for the majority of his life. He was definitely a little rough around the edges. Having never had a stable, parent-like figure in his life, he naturally developed a bit of a rebellious attitude. He was quite a handsome young man too, but that wasn't what initially attracted Savannah to him. It wasn't even a young crush she had on him. It was something more. Something she couldn't quite identify at the time. Everything about Bailey just caught her attention. The way he looked and dressed, the way he talked, and just the way he carried himself. Bailey, in his entirety, was just something that intrigued Savannah and made her want to get to know him. This was a particularly big deal since she hadn't met anyone else since her mother that she felt this way about. She had been a loner and she liked it that way. But the arrival of Bailey to the home had sparked something inside of her. Aside from her feelings, it seemed as if she didn't even exist in the eyes of Bailey. That wasn't too surprising though, as he seemed to treat all of his new foster siblings the same way. All he seemed to want to do was defy all of Meredith's rules and leave the foster home as soon as possible, and Savannah wanted to be right alongside him when he did. As days went by, Savannah continually tried coming up with ways to get Bailey to notice her. Despite her attempts, he barely seemed to know she even existed. So one day, she decided to take a different approach and do something that had been foreign to her at this point. When Meredith left late one morning to go out and get some shopping done, Savannah snuck upstairs into her room. She approached Meredith's vanity and began searching through the drawers. Eventually, she found what appeared to be a variety of unused makeup that was stashed away in a bag. She tucked the bag away in her pants and quickly proceeded back downstairs to her bedroom. For the next 2 hours, Savannah continually applied and washed off makeup as she tried teaching herself how to properly apply it. Eventually, she was able to figure it out, at least to an extent, and became satisfied with how she looked. Even without makeup, Savannah had been genetically blessed and was an extremely beautiful girl. But the makeup made her stand out from the rest of the other children, and also made her look a bit older than she really was. She was happy when she discovered that the makeup got her the attention she was hoping for. At this point, she went from being virtually non-existent to her foster siblings to being the center of attention, and she was doing all of this for one and one person only. It took time, but she eventually built up the courage to approach Bailey and strike up a conversation with him. Although Savannah had always kept to herself and was far from enthusiastic about her life at the foster home, she did follow the rules for the most part and didn't cause a lot of problems. But upon getting to know Bailey, her ideas and opinions began to change. Bailey wanted to rebel as much as possible and seemed like he was born to break the rules, and when he expressed these feelings to Savannah, she couldn't help but to agree with everything he said. It wasn't that she actually shared the same beliefs as Bailey, but she was willing to say and do anything to be accepted by him. As days passed, they continued spending more and more time together, and quickly developed a friendship. Although Savannah wasn't fully able to understand the feelings she had for Bailey, he filled a void in her life and gave her something to look forward to every day. Aside from school, They ended up being inseparable whenever possible. Meredith had set some rather strict rules for the children during the school year. They were only allowed out of the house to play on the weekends, and only for a short period of time. She wanted the children to stay focused on their schoolwork, and it also made it easier for her to keep track of them this way. Savannah and Bailey would occasionally sneak out together anyway, but only for short periods of time, as they feared one of them would get sent to a different house if they got caught. They would go get ice cream, candy, or fast food when they snuck out, things that Meredith didn't approve of them having otherwise. When the school year came to an end, and summer began, the two of them were excited to have some more freedom, and be able to spend more time away from the home. But what Savannah had in mind, and what Bailey had in mind, ended up being two very different things. Savannah was looking forward to doing the same, normal things, just more often. Meanwhile, Bailey turned out to have some plans that ended up being a bit more drastic. After returning home from her last day of school, Savannah found Bailey and asked them what they were doing that day. She was expecting that they would go get something to eat, or maybe even go to a movie, as they could get away with staying out later than usual. But to her surprise, he suggested they go hiking. He told her he knew about some amazing caves that were only around a 30-minute hike down a nearby trail. On its own, this wasn't something that sounded very appealing to Savannah, but she would have done anything Bailey asked and happily agreed. They made plans to meet outside after eating dinner. It was early June, the weather was perfect, and even after dinner, they knew they still had several hours of sunlight left. On their way to the hiking trail, they talked about everything and nothing at all. That was another thing that Savannah loved about Bailey. He never pried into her past or asked her the usual questions that everyone else did. But then Bailey surprised her and randomly opened up and shared his own past with her. He told her about the events that led him to ending up in foster care. Similar to Savannah, Bailey virtually had no family outside of his parents. They were either disconnected from the family, addicted to drugs, or dead. Bailey's parents themselves were involved with some pretty shady activities and the people that came with it. He could remember his parents drinking and fighting a lot. He's also able to look back and remember a lot of strange people regularly coming in and out of the household. But aside from that, he was probably too young to pick up on the other things his parents were involved in, and no one has ever elaborated on that for him later in his life. He can remember having a decent childhood with his parents despite these things, but when he was only 5 years old, life as he knew it came to a violent end. One night, he was woken up by distant screams coming from somewhere in his house. He was used to his parents fighting, but he had never heard screams like this before, or the loud banging noises associated with them. Although he was fearful, he immediately got out of his bed to investigate. While slowly walking down the hallway, things had gone silent at that point. He got to his parents' door, which was halfway open. When he entered the room, he and his life were completely changed from that point forward. He found both of his parents brutally murdered. He later found out that they were both shot, but at the time, all he saw was blood. His dad's body was lying halfway off the bed in a pool of blood. His mom was on the floor next to his bed, also covered in blood and unrecognizable. He called his parents names and shook them, regardless of their apparent condition. His next instinct was to run to the neighbor's house for help. As soon as he turned around to run out of his parents' room, he was met with a large man standing in front of him. Before he was even able to get a look at the man's face, he remembers being hit over the head with something hard. Things went hazy for him for the next couple minutes, but he came to and found himself in the bathtub. He touched his head and found a large amount of blood on his hand. He was sitting in about an inch of liquid with a strong smell that turned out to be gasoline. He got out of the bathtub and crawled to the door. He reached up to grab the handle, but pulled his hand off of it once he felt how hot it was. At that point, he also noticed a small amount of black smoke coming into the bathroom from underneath the door. Even at 5 years old, he was able to put all of this together and realize that there was a fire in his home. He got up to the window to try to open it. It was an old wooden frame window, and he used all of his might trying to open it. Unfortunately, he was only able to get it open a few inches and had no chance of escaping that way. The fire quickly spread, and the bathroom began getting extremely hot after the door had ignited. Out of desperation, he drained the gasoline out of the bathtub, turned on the shower with cold water, and laid down in the tub. A short while after doing this, he lost consciousness due to the smoke inhalation, and the next thing he knew, he was waking up in the back of an ambulance. Luckily, neighbors saw the fire and called emergency services. Firefighters entered the house, while others tried to put the fire out. They found Bailey in the bathtub, alive, but unconscious. Bailey was told if he hadn't opened the window, he probably would have died from smoke inhalation before he was found. It was that, and turning on the shower, that saved his life. The next day, while in the hospital, a caseworker confirmed something he already knew, that he would never see his parents again. After being released from the hospital, he ended up in foster care, and has been bounced around from home to home ever since. He told Savannah that the man who killed his parents was never caught. At that point, the two of them stopped walking, so Bailey could show Savannah the scar on his head where the man struck him 8 years prior, and told her it required staples due to how severe the blow was. Savannah just stared at him in awe. She brushed a piece of hair out of her face and struggled to find something to say. "Wow, you're amazing," was the only thing she was able to come up with. Bailey smiled at her and said, "Come on, we're getting close to the trail." They continued walking, and for the first time ever, Savannah found herself really opening up to someone. In the past, when people asked her about her life, she would always give them the bare minimum of an answer, but she told Bailey everything, without holding back all of the details she normally would. It was as if the pain from their past had connected them on some sort of subconscious level. By the time they finished hiking through the trail, they'd gotten to know each other much better than anyone else knew them. "Come on, it's right down here," Bailey said, as he offered his hand to Savannah to help her down off a small drop-off. Savannah took his hand and had the urge to not let go after she had safely made it down, but she resisted it. The two made their way into the tall, narrow cave. Savannah had never seen anything quite like this place, and she became even happier she agreed to come. She was surprised at how much colder it was down in the cave. The temperature in the cave was easily 20 degrees cooler than it was up above. After exploring the cave for nearly an hour, the two began hiking again. Bailey told Savannah he wanted to check out another area in the woods, and of course, she agreed. They hiked off the trail for 10 minutes, stepping over fallen branches and joking around with one another. Suddenly, Bailey turned around and signaled for Savannah to be quiet. Once Savannah got a better look at what was up ahead, it appeared that they were approaching some form of a campsite. As quietly as possible, they circled around the outside of the campsite and determined that no one was there. "We need to check this out and see if there's anything worth taking," said Bailey. Okay, replied Savannah. Bailey looked at Savannah for several seconds and asked, "You're okay with this, right?" "Oh, yeah, of course I am," she replied. This idea made her nervous and wasn't something she wanted to do, but she wasn't going to let Bailey know this. Bailey then told her that there was another spot down the hill that was commonly used by people as a makeshift campsite as well. He instructed Savannah to check out the campsite they were at, while he went to the one down the hill, in order for them to get home on time. This made Savannah that much more nervous, but she managed to force a smile as she said okay. Bailey took off down the hill, as Savannah hesitantly approached the belongings scattered throughout the area. At first, she was barely able to touch the belongings, as it just felt wrong to her. but then she imagined herself finding something cool or even valuable, and how impressed Bailey would be with her. It was that thought that inspired her to push on. She began rummaging through everything, but was mostly only finding trash and tattered clothing. She made her way over to some items underneath a partially broken picnic table. She found an old hunting knife and more trash, but there was also a box she noticed. She grabbed the box and began opening it, and that's when she heard, "Hey, what exactly do you think you're doing?" Savannah nearly jumped out of her skin as she quickly looked over towards the direction the voice was coming from. It was a middle-aged man walking fast in her direction. The man had dark hair, despite his overgrown beard, which was mostly gray. As he approached Savannah, he began looking around as if he were checking to make sure there was no one else with her. Savannah was frozen in fear and once again at a complete loss for words. "You think you could steal from me?" The man's eyes were once again trained on Savannah. I'm sorry," was all she could come up with to say. "You're sorry?" the man asked. "I'll show you sorry. In fact, I'll teach you a lesson, free of charge." Once the man got too close to her, Savannah tried to run, but it was too late. He cut her off and quickly grabbed a hold of her. Savannah cried out for help until the man covered her mouth with his hand. He began dragging her through the clearing towards the woods, and out of desperation, Savannah tried dropping to the ground to create dead weight for the man. She continued trying to fight the man off, but he quickly pinned her to the ground. He began scooting both of them closer to the woods, and just as Savannah began thinking about what the man is going to do to her, she hears a loud thud, and the man's grip loosens. She quickly crawls away from the man and stands up. Once she turns around, she sees the man lying on the ground, and Bailey standing above him with a bat-sized tree branch. She immediately runs over to Bailey and wraps her arms around him as she continues to cry. Bailey hugged her as well, but then quickly pushed her away. "Wait, he's getting up," he said. He picked the branch back up and struck the man in the head. The man fell back to the ground. "We need to get out of here," Savannah said. "He's still moving," replied Bailey. Bailey again struck the man, and then struck him once more. Savannah turned away from what was happening and plugged her ears, as the sound of the wood thudding against the man's head was more than she could bear to listen to. About what seemed like 30 seconds later, Savannah felt a hand on her back. It was Bailey, telling her they needed to go. Before leaving, she turned to get one more look at the man, and all she could see was blood. Savannah tried asking Bailey questions about the condition of the man, but he wouldn't answer. He just kept telling her they needed to get home, and that she couldn't mention what happened to anyone. "You're not going to tell anyone about this, right?" he asked. Of course not. You just saved my life," Savannah replied. It was quiet on the walk home that evening, and the cheerful joy they shared on the way to the park just a few hours earlier seemed almost like a distant memory. Once they were getting closer to home, Bailey finally broke the silence. "At 10 a.m. We'll leave tomorrow at 10 a.m. "Leave where?" Savannah asked. "After breakfast tomorrow. We'll leave the house at 10 a.m. I need you to come with me. I can't move the body by myself." "The body?" Savannah grabbed Bailey's arm so he would stop walking. "What do you mean the body?" she demanded. "I mean the body. That sick fuck back there. Do you even know what he was about to do to you?" Anyway, I do. I didn't mean to kill him or anything. I was just trying to protect you. And I ended up hearing his skull crack. At least I think I did. Either way, we have to go back there tomorrow and clean up. I'm sure your DNA is all over that guy. So, we'll leave tomorrow at 10 a.m. Bailey started walking again, and Savannah followed suit. Savannah reverted back to her old self again that night and talked to no one. She simply got home, took a shower, and went straight to bed. She struggled to fall asleep that night, but eventually, the exhaustion from the ordeal earlier that day won over. When she was woken up the following morning, her mind went directly to the event that was planned for after breakfast, and her heart began racing. She was barely able to eat breakfast, but managed to force it down. She returned to her bedroom to begin getting ready for the long walk back to the park. When she walked outside right at 10 a.m., Bailey was already outside waiting for her. He smiled at her, undoubtedly relieved by her presence. The two began walking back to the park. Several times, Bailey tried to initiate a conversation with Savannah, but all of his attempts fell flat. After making it down the trail at the park, they cut into the woods, just like the previous day as they approached the campsite. The tension grew with every step they took. "If you see anyone around the campsite, run," Bailey said softly. Savannah just stared back at him with widened eyes. Once they finally made it to their destination, it looked like it was clear. In fact, to their horror and confusion, the man that Bailey had attacked wasn't even there. Bailey and Savannah looked at each other, and both could see the panic in the other's eyes. Savannah immediately expressed her panic with a barrage of questions. "What do we do now?" "I don't know." "Well, where did he go?" "I don't know." "Do you think someone found him?" "I don't know." The way Bailey raised his voice scared Savannah, and she instantly became quiet. "Sorry," said Bailey. I'm freaking out right now, and I don't need to take it out on you. Let's just look around and see if we can find anything, and if we don't, we'll go home and never talk about this again." The two began searching the area, and it didn't take them long to find out that the man was indeed alive when they left him lying on the ground yesterday. But it didn't look like he was alive for long. They discovered his body about 20 feet deep into the woods, where he must have crawled while attempting to get help before succumbing to his injuries. It was at that point that Savannah got a real look at his injuries. Bailey noticed the shock and horror on her face. "Hey, can you start collecting dead leaves and twigs? Just anything dead and dry, okay?" Savannah nodded her head and started walking around. After about 20 minutes, the two of them had a large quantity of materials that would burn easily, including some of the man's own possessions from his camp. Bailey removed a large bottle of lighter fluid from his pocket and sprayed it all over the man. He covered the man up with all of the material they had collected and sprayed the rest of the bottle on top of the pile. Bailey looked over at Savannah. "As soon as I light this, we run." Savannah again nodded at him with tears in her eyes. "This guy was a piece of shit, Savannah. He was going to rape and murder you. Do you understand? We are doing the world a favor." "I know," she replied. I'm just scared." Bailey reassured her once more it was going to be okay. He pulled out a matchbook, ignited the material on top of the man, and he and Savannah took off. They ran through the woods the quickest they could without falling down. They didn't stop running until they made it all the way down the trail and to the street. Savannah stopped to catch her breath. "Keep walking," demanded Bailey. They walked for several more minutes, and once they finally weren't gasping for breath, Bailey said, "We never talk about this again. This never happened." Savannah assured him that she would never say a word about it, and they created an alibi for themselves for the past 2 days, just to be safe. Obviously, neither of them were surprised when they heard about the remains of a man being found in the woods just a few miles from where they lived. They tried to casually follow the story on the news the best they could without creating any suspicion by having too much interest in it. It didn't take long for the news to report that the man was a victim of a homicide, as a medical examiner was able to find obvious blunt force trauma to his head. Several days after the man's death was ruled a homicide, dental records showed him to be 44-year-old Gerald Stanton. Gerald was a homeless man with a criminal record. Most of his offenses were rather minor, ranging from drug possession to petty theft. But the news did also mention something that terrified Savannah. Roughly 8 years prior to his death, Gerald spent 4 years in prison for a sex crime involving a minor. When she heard this, it also made her feel differently about what happened. Although the man had attacked her, she still felt a level of guilt based on how he died. But now, she was just left with a feeling of gratitude for Bailey, as the news confirmed the man was capable of doing what she had already suspected he was going to do to her. The police were trying to establish some type of motive and identify any possible suspects, but had no initial leads. The next few weeks were nothing but pure hell and fear for Savannah, but soon, Gerald's death became a cold case, and the police seemed to lose interest in it, as they were kept busy with plenty of other cases anyhow. Savannah and Bailey, still both never speaking of what had happened, finally began to go back to sharing their friendship together and doing a lot of normal things they were used to doing before the incident. It was the middle of summer, and they spent their days coming up with small bits of money to buy ice cream or occasionally go to McDonald's. At first, in order for them to come up with money, they would do things more on the minor side. They would steal tips off of tables left at restaurants, or spend the day checking vending machines for leftover change. But over the next couple years, both their relationship and the extent of their crimes continued to grow. By the time Savannah was 13 and Bailey was 16, they had several schemes down pat. It was also around this time that their relationship started to become one on the more romantic side. Whenever they were able to leave the home together, they always had something plotted out. Savannah would enter a convenience store. She would use her good looks and charm to distract the cashier by asking them questions or asking for directions. Meanwhile, Bailey would enter the same store a minute after her, pocketing whatever they wanted while the cashier was distracted. They had a similar scheme they used every Sunday. They would find homes for sale around their area that had open houses scheduled. The pair would show up, claiming to be brother and sister. They would tell the realtor that their mother was interested in the house and sent the two to ask questions since she was stuck at work. Savannah would again charm the realtor as Bailey wandered off, stealing any valuables he could, from jewelry to prescription medications, anything the two could sell later on. Bailey always masterminded their schemes, promising Savannah that he would soon go get a job and that it would all end. Still infatuated with Bailey, she believed every word he said and would gladly go along with anything he had planned out for them. But despite the promises Bailey made, his willingness to commit crimes only seemed to increase as time went on. Eventually, anytime the two of them were able to leave the house, they would canvass a nearby upper-class neighborhood. They would specifically try to familiarize themselves with the routines of the homeowners that lived in the neighborhood, and before Savannah knew it, they were actually breaking into people's homes. Despite the progression of their criminal activity, Savannah always kept faith that she would be safe if she kept close to Bailey, and that one day he would earn money the honest way. Time went on, and the couple split their free time between enjoying each other's company and planning their next hit. Their routine normally consisted of robbing a house and then living like normal until they began running out of money. They would ride their bikes to various neighborhoods, trying to avoid hitting too many houses in the same area. They tried planning their crimes as carefully as possible and managed to stay underneath the radar. It wasn't until Savannah was about to turn 15 when she began having doubts about her and Bailey's future. Bailey himself was going to turn 18 soon, and at that point, as an adult, he would be responsible for providing his own housing. Savannah would often ask him about what he was going to do and where he was going to live. He was never able to give her an exact answer or tell her what his plan was. He would always just respond by telling her that he would figure it out and not to worry about it. Savannah trusted him and took his word, but without an actual plan in mind, she still had her worries. The day of Savannah's 15th birthday, she woke up to find Bailey waiting for her. He wished her a happy birthday and told her he had a surprise waiting for her. After eating breakfast and getting ready for the day, the two left the house together like normal. Instead of getting on their bikes, Bailey insisted that they take this particular trip on foot. They held hands and laughed together as they walked in the direction of the woods nearby, the same woods their fateful encounter took place at years prior. Before reaching the woods, they turned to walk down a dead-end street. At the end of the street was a car that Bailey had stolen the night before. Savannah was shocked and hesitant to get into the car, but like usual, she followed the directions that Bailey gave her and got in anyway. "How did you find this car?" Savannah asked. "I snuck out late last night. That elderly woman that never leaves her house, this is her car. I was trying to find a car that was unlocked and had keys in it somewhere, but didn't have any luck. So when I ended up at her house, I found an unlocked window and voila!" Savannah was stunned. This was the first time either of them has stolen anything of this caliber. "So what now?" she asked. "Well," Bailey said, "you know how you've been asking me about where I'm going to live once I turn 18? I finally figured it out. We're going to rob a bank downtown." Bailey had a smile on his face as he told Savannah his plan. "Are you kidding me?" she asked. "How do you expect to pull that off?" "I have the perfect plan," he said. "We're going to park down the block from the bank. We'll both go in, with our faces covered, of course, and you'll make sure no one moves or calls the police, and I'll collect the money. Then we sprint to the car and leave. We'll just do this once. Statistically, people don't ever get caught the first time they rob a bank." Still stunned, Savannah asked, And how am I supposed to make sure no one moves or calls the police?" At that point, Bailey pulled a gun out of his pocket. Savannah was both terrified and thrilled when she saw it. It was the first time she had seen a gun up close like that. "I found this a while back in one of the houses we hit," Bailey said, still smiling. Savannah found herself at a crossroad. Almost every part of her was telling her not to go through with what Bailey was suggesting. But she was also taken back by what Bailey was promising her, that they would get money from the bank and get their own home. Bailey would find a job and they would live happily together. Despite her better judgment, she agreed to his plan. "So, when are we going to do this?" she asked. "Now," Bailey replied. "Now? I'm not ready to do this now," Savannah said. "Look, right now is the best time. The bank is about to open. All you have to do is point a gun and make sure no one moves. It'll be easy." Savannah's heart began racing, and she started playing the events through her head of what she thought it was going to be like. Before she knew it, Bailey handed her the gun and the mask, and then started the car. She felt like she was going to have a panic attack, but just kept picturing what her perfect future with Bailey was going to look like. It seemed like they got to the bank in a blink of an eye. "You can do this," Bailey said. He gave her a kiss, and they got out of the car. They concealed the items they were going to use during the robbery until they got close to the property of the bank. With masks on, the pair walked into the bank and Savannah pulled out the gun. She pointed it towards the tellers, trying not to drop it from how hard her hands were shaking. Bailey began screaming, demanding they give him the money from all of their drawers. Savannah looked around, and to her relief, there didn't appear to be any customers in the bank at the time. All of the yelling from Bailey suddenly brought Savannah back to when she was just a little girl. For a moment, she zoned out and was brought back to a time she found herself hiding in a closet while her parents fought. She was quickly snapped out of it when someone grabbed her arm. "Let's go," Bailey said, and the two began sprinting for the car. They got in the car and took off. Bailey had little experience driving, but was speeding through the streets as quickly as possible anyway. He tossed the bag over to Savannah and told her to count the money. "I don't know," she said. "There's so much, there must be several thousand." Bailey began laughing out of excitement. "I told you this would be perfect!" he exclaimed. They continued on to the next part of their plan. They were going to drive about an hour out of town to a farming community. They wanted to lay low for a few hours until returning to town, ditching the car somewhere before walking the rest of the way home. Savannah began transferring all the money into a backpack they had brought. "Let's kill some time by getting something to eat. What kind of food sounds good to you?" Bailey asked. "Anywhere. We can afford more than McDonald's finally," Savannah replied. The two continued driving, expressing their happiness for pulling the robbery off. But after about 45 minutes of driving, Bailey suddenly noticed a cop behind them. He became nervous and told Savannah what he saw. She turned around to look for herself. "Don't do that," demanded Bailey. "Just act normal." The two continued driving, trying to look straight ahead, praying that this cop didn't put his lights on as their hearts nearly pounded out of their chests. Bailey, although not very familiar with the area, decided he would start turning down some streets to see if the cop would follow him. He knew if he got pulled over, they would be in a lot of trouble. Bailey never got his driver's license. Because of this, he knew the car would be seized and searched, and all of the cash would be found. And then it struck him. The car! It was stolen. The officer could run the plates, and if the woman had already reported it, they would be getting pulled over for sure. Bailey's anxiety increased, and he turned onto another street. The cop followed. He turned again, and still, the cop followed along. And before he could try to think of what to do next, his fears were realized, and the cop turned his lights on. "What do we do now?" Savannah asked, obviously terrified. Just play it cool. We don't know what he knows yet, okay?" replied Bailey. Bailey pulled over to the side of the road and rolled down his window. He took a few deep breaths and did his best to calm himself down so he didn't raise any extra suspicion with the officer. "How you doing?" asked the officer. "The reason I pulled you over was because you crossed over the center line a couple miles back." "Oh, sorry," replied Bailey. "I'm still a bit of a new driver. I just got my driver's license recently." "No problem," the officer said. "Do you have your license and proof of insurance with you?" No, I forgot my license at home," replied Bailey. "Okay, well, give me your social security number and I'll pull your info up that way." "I don't have my social security number memorized," replied Bailey, knowing that wasn't very believable at his age. The officer gave him an apprehensive look. "I'm gonna need you two to step out of the vehicle for now until we can figure this out," he said. Both Bailey and Savannah exited the vehicle. The officer instructed Savannah to sit down on the curb and cross her legs. She did exactly as the officer asked, as she used all of her might to hold back her tears. Even with the things she went through as a child, she had never been this terrified before. The officer turned his attention back to Bailey and said, "Put your hands on the trunk. I just need to give you a quick pat down to make sure you don't have any weapons on you or anything." Bailey began stepping over to the trunk, and as Savannah gave in, she put her head down into her hands and started crying. "Hey, stay still!" was the last thing she heard before the gun went off. The noise of the gunshot snapped her head up out of her hands, and what she saw made her feel like her life was over. Bailey stood over top of the officer, who was lying on the ground. She saw a pool of blood collecting around his head. She then looked up at Bailey as he shouted, "Come on, let's go!" Hey guys, I just wanted to say thank you so much for listening. I am sorry that I haven't uploaded recently. I got horribly sick from, I don't know if it was a flu or something similar. Not only did I feel like crap, but I basically had no voice for a while too. There is going to be a part 2 to this video, so in a couple days, part 2 to this story will be up, which will be the final conclusion, and then a couple days after that, I will have Bullied Part 3 up for you guys. And I've got a ton more stuff planned. You guys are seriously the best. I mean, the support and outreach I get compared to the numbers of subscribers I have is just like awesome. So I thank you guys so much. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and share it if you so choose to. And if you are not subscribed, then please subscribe for more. Thank you guys again.